Developing a knight here gracefully prepares for kingside castling and puts early pressure on the d4 square. Asserting central dominion right away, this challenges white's initial flexible setup and opens clear avenues for piece development. Establishing a central pawn presence immediately fights for the key squares and opens avenues for piece development. Developing the knight to a natural square prepares for castling and contests the center's rich potential. Challenging the center's pawn structure, this creates immediate tension and opens lines for rapid piece development. Solidifying the center, black prepares to develop pieces harmoniously and contest central space. Asserting pressure on the knight, this bishop's development prepares to challenge black's central pawn structure by potentially pinning the knight. Disrupting white's central pawns and knight structure, this check forces a choice between awkward piece development and pawn concessions. Developing the knight to c3 supports the central pawn structure and prepares for a potential kingside castling. Challenging the bishop's influence, this pawn advance initiates a subtle pawn structure battle, potentially opening lines for your queen or rook later. Sacrificing the bishop for the knight here fundamentally alters the pawn structure, opening lines that were previously blocked and creating potential weaknesses around black's king. Observe how the capture exchanges a long-range piece for a knight that was key to black's central control, potentially empowering white's queenside play and forcing black to consider the long-term consequences of a doubled pawn. This transition from a closed to a more open game demands a keen eye for piece activity and pawn dynamics. Reclaiming the material with the queen now exposes her to potential tempo gains and a slightly more awkward development compared to recapturing with the pawn, a decision that sacrifices a touch of structural integrity for immediate piece activity. Solidifying the pawn chain and preparing to castle kingside, this move aims for king safety and central stability before delving into more active play. Finally, the king finds a safe haven from the center's fray, preparing to join the queenside counterplay and potentially influence the d-file battle, while also solidifying the pawn structure against any premature central thrusts. Fortifying the central d-pawn and preparing to contest the crucial c-file, this maneuver cleverly anchors the rook, subtly preparing for potential pawn pushes or even a future exchange sacrifice on the open column. Sacrificing the pawn opens up white's queen's bishop diagonal, potentially creating immediate threats. Losing material like this, even temporarily, often signals a shift towards a more tactical battle where precise calculation becomes paramount. Accepting the pawn might seem tempting, but the subsequent forced exchanges could leave black's kingside exposed to attack. This capture abandons the central pawn structure, inviting white to establish a strong foothold in the middle of the board. The pawn snatch disrupts black's previously solid pawn chain, potentially leading to weaknesses in the later stages of the game. White resolves the tension on the c4 square, activating the bishop and preparing to challenge black's pawn structure. This exchange, while losing the bishop pair, opens lines and aims for immediate central influence, potentially leading to an active piece play. Black must now consider how to consolidate their pawn majority and defend against white's energetic setup. Challenging white's pawn center, black aims to disrupt the harmonious pawn structure and potentially open lines for his pieces, though it does create a dynamic imbalance where white might exploit the central tension. Securing the king with castling now redirects white's attention to consolidating their central pawn structure and potentially challenging black's d5 pawn, aiming to exploit any weaknesses created by the capture on c4. Sacrificing material for activity often carries inherent risks, but here it unlocks diagonals for the queen and bishop, aiming to disrupt white's centralized pawn structure and open lines for counterplay. Unleashing the knight to the formidable e4 square creates immediate pressure on black's queenside pawn structure and eyes the c5 diagonal, potentially disrupting black's pawn chain and opening lines for white's pieces. The queen repositions to avoid immediate threats and to bolster the pawn structure on the queenside, though it sacrifices some attacking impetus for solid defense. Challenging black's queenside pawn structure and threatening to usurp crucial space, this advance aims to disrupt the fluidity of white's queenside development and force black into a decision regarding the future of the isolated c4 pawn. Retreating the bishop to a5 aims to preserve it from potential attacks after the pawn grab, while simultaneously setting up a long-term outpost on the queen side if white doesn't address the pawn on c4. It's a defensive maneuver that sidesteps immediate tactical threats but may cede some central influence and allows white to consolidate their pawn structure. Securing the queen on the fourth rank, white immediately challenges black's central pawn structure and aims to exploit the open d-file, while simultaneously preparing to potentially support an e4 pawn push. Re-establishing the bishop's influence on the long diagonal, this repositioning seeks to regain some of the central pressure lost earlier and potentially prepare a queenside expansion. Unleashing the queen to d6, white aggressively targets black's pawn structure and eyes potential weaknesses around the castled king, a bold declaration of intent to disrupt the serene harmony white's opponent had painstakingly built. Developing the knight to c6 fortifies the pawn structure and prepares to challenge white's queen, aiming to disrupt the harmony of white's pieces. The rook now occupies the central column, aiming to exert pressure along the open file and potentially support an advance of the e-pawn, creating a harmonious piece setup where each unit contributes to a unified offensive plan against black's slightly cramped queenside. Pondering a defensive retreat for the rook, black aims to consolidate the d-file, a crucial corridor currently dominated by white's forces, while simultaneously preparing to contest it directly. Initiating the queen exchange here simplifies the position significantly, steering play towards an endgame where white's slight material edge, specifically, the more active rook on the d-file, will become more pronounced. The removal of black's queen, a key defender and potential attacker, eases white's defensive burdens and opens avenues for future pawn breaks or piece maneuvering on the queen side. This calculated retreat of your monarch from the center also contributes to a safer king position, a crucial consideration in any transition to a less cluttered board. The exchange of queens has undeniably simplified the position, ushering in a new phase of play. Black's knight, now firmly planted on e7, seems to be consolidating its presence in the center, eyeing the d5 square with potential. Observe how the pawn structure remains relatively symmetrical, a testament to the recent queen trade. This knight transfer signals a shift towards a more maneuvering game where piece activity and well-timed pawn thrusts will become paramount. Consider the long-term implications for pawn control on the queen side. Black will need to be vigilant. The knight repositions to a powerful outpost, threatening immediate disruption to black's pawn structure and potentially forcing awkward exchanges, while simultaneously bolstering white's central control and setting the stage for a dynamic middle game. The bishop's retreat to c7 strategically repositions it to a more active diagonal, creating potential pressure on white's d6 knight and eyeing the kingside if white overextends. Unleashing a knight to the b5 outpost, white aims to disrupt black's central pawn structure and potentially create pressure on the queenside. This maneuver subtly repositions the knight from its more passive placement on d6, where it was somewhat hemmed in by its own pawns, to a more active square that eyes several key squares, including c7 and d6. The intention is likely to provoke a reaction from black, forcing a decision about how to defend the threatened piece or respond to the growing spatial advantage white is trying to establish. It's a classic example of piece repositioning that seeks to improve harmony and exert pressure without an immediate tactical threat, inviting black into a strategic dance. A bold repositioning, aiming to leverage the bishop's influence on the long diagonal while implicitly challenging white's knight on d6, which suddenly looks a bit overextended and potentially vulnerable if black can coordinate counterplay. This placement also prepares for a potential knight transfer to c5 or even a5, forcing white to make further concessions or develop defensively. Initiating a rook exchange on the open d-file immediately simplifies the position and steers the game towards an endgame where controlling the central files becomes paramount. Accepting the exchange simplifies the position and aims to exploit the slightly awkward placement of the knight on d6. Initiating a knight maneuver, this piece now occupies a central square, poised to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially control key diagonals. Re-establishing the knight's central presence after the exchange on d8 opens up avenues for future activity, aiming to pressure white's pawn structure. Clearing the central path opens up the d-file for immediate pressure, forcing black to defend actively. Embracing the doubled pawns fundamentally reshapes the pawn structure, creating a permanent weakness on the c-file, but offering a potential pathway for queenside expansion with the upcoming b-pawn advance. A bold foray into enemy territory, this knight's advance on d6 immediately asserts pressure on the lightly defended c7 square, hinting at future tactical skirmishes and potentially forcing black into a passive defensive posture. Initiating a pawn advance on the queenside aims to carve out some breathing room and perhaps create potential weaknesses for the opponent's advanced knight. Stabilizing the pawn structure on the queenside solidifies white's control over the file and prevents black from creating counterplay through advancing thereupon further. Developing the bishop to a more active square, aiming to untangle the position and potentially create counterplay on the kingside, acknowledging the current pawn structure that favors white's control of the d-file and potential central advances. Asserting control over the open d-file, the rook's redeployment now challenges black's doubled pawns and aims to exploit any lingering weakness in their structure. Consolidating the king's position becomes paramount, seeking a safer haven from potential future skirmishes on the central files and aiming to connect the rooks once the minor pieces are off the board. Securing the queenside pawn structure by advancing the b-pawn prevents black from easily establishing a knight outpost on b4 or using the file for any potential infiltration, offering white a more stable platform for the upcoming endgame. Activating the bishop towards the kingside provides a potential pawn lever on the queenside if opportunities arise, while keeping an eye on the d4 square as a possible future outpost for pieces should white's pawn structure weaken. Solidifying the kingside pawn structure is the primary intention here, preparing for potential pawn advances later and creating a safe haven for the monarch. Activating the king is paramount in this simplified structure, allowing it to participate in the upcoming exchanges and potentially shepherd the pawns. Relocating the king to the light squares of the kingside aims to bolster its security behind the pawn wall, while simultaneously preparing for a potential central pawn advance or supporting the rook's activity on the d-file. Consolidating the bishop's outpost is a sensible idea, reinforcing the outpost and seeking to activate the pieces. This knight repositions to a more active square, threatening to penetrate the queenside and creating discomfort for black's central pawns. Challenging the central pawn structure and seeking active piece play, black injects dynamic energy into this somewhat static position. Re-anchoring the knight to the king's flank initiates a strategic repositioning, aiming to regain control of the d6 square and potentially pressure black's now somewhat isolated bishop. Asserting control over the central diagonal with the bishop sets up potential pressure against white's slightly uncoordinated pieces, aiming to exploit the semi-open c-file and probe for weaknesses around the kingside as the game simplifies. Piloting the king towards the center offers a glimpse of future endgame possibilities, aiming to activate the monarch for potential defensive duties or to join the skirmish on the central files once the pawn structure solidifies. The bishop now regains its post on the fianchetto diagonal, preparing to influence the weakened kingside and potentially support a later e5 pawn push, aiming for greater central activity. Initiating a pawn storm on the kingside, this advance aims to unbalance the board and create attacking chances. Here's an analysis of the move 31, f4. This move is a proactive attempt to generate some dynamic play. White is trying to create weaknesses in black's pawn structure, specifically targeting the central pawns. By pushing f4, white is trying to open lines for their rook on d1 and potentially activate their knight on d2. It's a double-edged sword, though, as it can also create weaknesses in white's own kingside. Key considerations for white after f4. Opening the f-file. Asterisk if black allows it, white might eventually be able to use the f-file for an attack. Asterisk creating pawn breaks. The move challenges black's central pawn chain and could lead to a more open game, which might favor white if they can coordinate their pieces. Potential weaknesses: pushing pawns, especially on the king side, can sometimes leave the king exposed. White needs to be careful about black's counterplay. Black's response options: asterisk. Black has several ways to react. They could push f5, directly challenging white's pawn and potentially opening up lines on the king side for themselves. Push e5, aiming for a more central pawn break. Reinforce the center, simply defending their pawn structure and waiting to see white's next move. Ignore it, continue with their own plans, perhaps focusing on piece activity. This move signals a shift in white's strategy from a more positional, maneuvering game to one seeking more concrete action. The resulting play will likely be quite sharp. Unleashing pawn storms in front of your king is a double-edged sword. While it promises dynamic counterplay and aims to disrupt white's positional advantage, it simultaneously exposes the monarch and can lead to catastrophic weaknesses if not perfectly calculated. Reasserting central influence, the knight repositions to a more active square, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially infiltrate the kingside. A bold attempt to liberate the queenside pawns from their cramped confinement, aiming to create dynamism and potentially open lines for the bishop on b7. Reclaiming central influence, this knight hops back to an outpost, eyeing the potentially weakened dark squares around black's king and aiming to support a future pawn push. Shedding that bishop simplifies the position, aiming to exploit the queenside pawns, which are now somewhat isolated. Opening the f-file offers dynamic possibilities, but also exposes your monarch to potential future attacks if black manages to activate their pieces along that newly available diagonal. Reclaiming influence on the queenside, the bishop activates by landing on a square where it can potentially disrupt white's pawn structure and support a future advance. The rook establishes a formidable outpost, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially infiltrate the queenside. Sacrificing the bishop to disrupt white's central pawn structure and gain initiative after white recaptures creates immediate dynamic play. Opening the b-file offers a promising avenue for your rook to infiltrate black's position and exploit the doubled pawns. Embracing the open file, the rook arrives on the b-file, immediately challenging the pawn structure and seeking opportunities to infiltrate white's position. The rook's aggressive advance to the 6th rank immediately disrupts black's pawn structure and threatens to sever the connection between the pawn and the remaining pieces, creating a significant territorial imbalance. Unleashing the rook to the 4th rank immediately challenges white's control over the open c-file and opens up aggressive possibilities for black's remaining pieces, hinting at a daring counterattack where piece activity might outweigh structural weaknesses. Seizing the open file, white now exerts pressure on the queenside, aiming to exploit black's slightly exposed king and potential pawn weaknesses. Seizing that open file offers a chance to disrupt white's coordinated pieces and perhaps force concessions on the queenside, though vigilance against counterplay along the now open diagonal is paramount. The monarch abandons its central strongpoint, preparing to defend the queenside pawns while aiming to activate its remaining pieces in the upcoming pawn endgame. The king makes a bold step forward, seeking an active role and potential pawn support on the queenside, but risks exposure if white can consolidate the center. Securing the open file with the rook is paramount now, preventing black's queen from becoming a dominant force on the 7th rank and preparing for a potential endgame advantage. The black king, no longer safely tucked away, ventures out into the fray, aiming to support the isolated pawns and potentially create counterplay down the now open c-file. Securing the open file with the rook is a strategic imperative now that black's king has ventured out, aiming to exploit the queenside pawns. The rook's journey to a1 feels like a desperate attempt to find some life, but it's essentially trapped behind its own pawn chain, offering little in the way of counterplay while allowing white's king to become much more active. Unlocking the potential of the queenside pawn majority is the primary objective now, aiming to create a passed pawn and overwhelm the opponent's defenses. Black's pawn push here shores up the queenside, aiming to create a safe haven for their king and potentially restrict white's rook activity. But it also concedes the queenside majority to white, and might offer white's king an avenue for queenside infiltration later, if not handled carefully. Pushing the rook to the 8th rank aggressively threatens a swift checkmate down the d-file and forces black's king into a precarious central position, potentially isolating the pawn. A pawn push towards the enemy's territory is launched, aiming to disrupt white's consolidating position and potentially create further complications. Securing the passed pawn's advance becomes paramount. The king's repositioning aims to support its final push toward promotion. Re-establishing activity on the open, a file is a priority for black, but the rook's placement seems a bit premature given white's king's secure position and the active rook on d8. Forces the black king to step onto a more exposed square, setting up a potential trap with the rook now eyeing the vulnerable pawn on a3. The black king, after a brief spell of apparent safety near the kingside, now boldly steps into the center, seeking refuge and perhaps even an active role in the endgame. The white king's bold advance claims the central territory, directly challenging the rook's pressure and aiming to solidify control over the now open file, a crucial pathway for potential future pawn pushes. A desperate check, aiming to disrupt white's king's safety and potentially salvage something from this difficult rook endgame. The king boldly ventures forward, seeking to support the advancing pawns and gain crucial central squares, hoping to anchor its defense before black's disruptive pieces can establish dominance. The material is even, but black's king is now exposed to immediate threats from the rook and knight as they begin to coordinate. Restoring the rook to the open d-file asserts dominance, preparing to exploit the weak pawns on the queenside and potentially launch a decisive attack. The black king suddenly emerges from its protected haven, venturing into the chaotic heart of the board, a bold gambit to disrupt white's now dominant rook on the 8th rank.